Sawa. All right, so good morning, everyone, and we welcome you to our conversation this morning. My name is Winnie Ogejo, and I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs. For those who are joining us for the first time, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a public policy think tank. And what we do is we conduct research, and of our research findings, use them to engage in policy conversations, such as the one we are having this morning. And this is our webinar number 3 of this year. A quick housekeeping before we move to the reason we are here this morning. You notice that your cameras and your microphones are off. It will be off through the presentation section, and after which, during the plenary, you will have an opportunity to unmute yourselves and ask your questions. But should you have a question as the presentation is going on, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A provision on your Teams, and then we will have an opportunity to respond to those questions during the plenary. So that's just it for the housekeeping. So today's conversation is on the state of public school distribution in Kenya. And we will be focusing on whether education infrastructure is equitably and efficiently aligned with the population needs and development priorities. And this conversation for us is very important because we believe at the Institute that education is a foundational public good, and this is because it has very positive externalities, and it also plays a critical role in the development, in capital development and long-term economic growth. So that is why for us, the issues around education are very important. And if we take you back, the IEA is implementing its second year of its new strategic plan, and the pillars that are supporting it, what we are calling our antecedents. Part of it is the deteriorating provision of public goods. And so we are seeing a lot of deterioration in the provision of public goods, evidenced by the work we have been doing over a period of time. And so education is one of such goods. So today, the objective of today's discussion is just to assess equity and efficiency in public schools and in public school distribution, and also identify regional and socio-economic disparities in the access, and at the end of it, generate or have evidence-based policy recommendations. So my colleagues Kwame and Vivian will be taking us through today's conversation, and Vivian will begin by, just off the outline, looking at the distribution and number of public schools across the country. And this is just to help us understand whether these schools are located, where the schools' locations reflect population patterns or regional needs. So that's when we'll be discussing distribution and number of public schools, that is what we will be aiming to achieve. And then the discussion will then look at the number of students. And in looking at the number of students, we will be looking at student enrollment patterns. And we will be aiming to show the variations in access and retention across different regions. Having looked at the number of students, we will then now look at student to school ratios. And the key indicators, as Vivian will be showing us, is the congestion, service quality, and the balance between efficiency and equity in the provision of education. Then we will move to examining the Ministry of Education expenditure. And why this is an important part is we will be hoping that at the end of the webinar, the quick question we will answer by looking at the Ministry expenditure is whether education resources are allocated based on needs, or whether the spending translates into improved access and the outcomes, access and outcomes, and where the gaps are greater. So when the ministry is allocating funds, what are the priority areas that they should actually be looking at? So in the end, then Kwame will come and give us the conclusions and the possible recommendations. And our recommendations, as you will be noticing, will be largely evidence-based. So remember, what we are trying to look at is the state of public school distribution in Kenya. And you've seen what's happening, especially with the grade 10 reporting. We've seen a lot of questions being raised on schools preparedness. And we are asking ourselves, is it an infrastructural, the preparedness, is it an infrastructural question? The availability of spaces in these schools, or what really is the issue when we're looking at what happened, especially with the transition from grade 9 to grade 10. So without further ado, I would like to invite my colleague Vivian to take us through the first part of the presentation. And Vivian has 25 minutes to make a presentation. But remember, in the process of a presentation, you can feel free to chat or to type in your questions should you have any. So Vivian, karibu sana, you have 25 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Winnie. I hope you can hear me. So I'll take you through the introduction. I'll start with the introduction. Sorry, can you share the slides, please? Okay, thank you. So for the introduction, first we're understanding why are we focusing on education. So number one, we are able to note that education is a constitutional right. If you look at our constitution under Article 43, it states that every person has a right to education. So since every person has a right to education, so it is important to understand how the sector is in Kenya. Then number two, education sector, it is the largest public service on both the supply and the demand side. So the supply is the number of employees, there are many teachers, and on the demand side, we have the number of students from all the way from pre-primary to university levels. And according to data, it shows that almost 40% of Kenyan population wake up in the morning to go to school. So it is one of the largest public service provided in Kenya. Then another thing is that education is a private good, and we know the characteristics of a private good. Private goods are excludable and rivalrous. So education is a private good, but with a positive externality. So that makes it important to be considered. So it is a private good because we know access can be restricted and also learning resources are limited. Now, let us see what is the benefit of good education. So there are three major benefits of good education. Number one is education is a driver of human capital. So we know very well education gives people knowledge, skills, ability that makes them more productive. So it is a driver of human capital. Then number two, education is a driver of intergenerational mobility. So education helps children to do better than their parents. So how does it help? So it allows children from poor background to access better jobs and helps to break that cycle of poverty that is supposed to be passed from one generation to another. So when a nation or when a generation is educated, so it breaks that cycle of poverty. Then lastly, it is a regional development. It is a drive of regional development. So education helps to spread development across regions, not just in big cities, but we know that some schools and college create jobs locally. So it helps to develop regions equally. Now let us see the distribution and number of public schools. So we want to go to our data and see the facts, how the public schools are distribution. distributed. So the first chart we are able to see, so it shows us the number of public schools in Kenya. So public schools, the number of public schools in Kenya, both from pre-primary all the way to universities. So when you look at our chart, the blue bar shows us the pre-primary school. Then we have the orange bar that shows us the primary schools in public schools in Kenya, then the secondary public schools in Kenya, then the university. The universities are almost invisible because they are few. So we are able to note from that the pre-primary schools are the highest in number, then followed by primary, then by secondary, then lastly by universities. So this can be attributed to two factors. Number one, it can show that as a education level increases, fewer people demand for it, and you are able to see that by the response to supply. Now, fewer schools are supplied at secondary and also at universities level. Then then another thing on the supply side, we are able to note here, we know very well that the higher the level, the more expensive for it to be supplied because of the higher construction cost. So another thing we are noting here is that when we look at this data, we're able to know that public schools, the number of public schools grew between 2020 and 2024. It increased by 6.4%. Then for secondary school, so when you go to secondary school, it increased by 4%. So the number of public secondary schools between 2020 and 2024 increased by 4.3%. So that is something worth noting. Yes, next slide. Now, chart 2 tells us the number of public schools in different counties. So this now shows the distribution per county. This is as of 2020. So this was the latest statistical booklet that was published that shows the distribution of secondary schools per county. So in 2020, Kitui had the largest or the highest number of public schools as compared to Lamu that had the least. So Lamu is a small county. So Kitui had the largest at 443 schools. Then on average, we have in 2020, there were 194 schools. So if we assume that every county was to have an equal number of schools, on average, every county was supposed to have 194 schools. But we are able to note that almost 20 are having school above average, and about 26 counties are having schools below the average number of schools. So that is the distribution of number of public schools per county. Next. So so we have seen the supply side. So let us see on the demand side, how many students or how many pupils enroll in those available schools. So chart 3 shows us the total enrollment in primary and secondary schools. So the first line shows us the primary enrollment. Then the second line shows us the secondary enrollment. So we are able to note that over the period of time between 2020 and 2024, the total school enrollment, this is both private and public, the total school enrollment has been increasing, primary increasing from 10.1 all the way to 10.7. It has not been increasing that much. So on average for the average growth rate for primary is 1.4. So between 2020 and 2024, the average growth rate for primary schools is 1.4. Then let us look at the orange bar, which represent the secondary enrollment data. So between 2020 and 2024, we have seen it has been increasing over time from 3.5 all the way to 4.3. So for secondary, average growth rate is at 5.2. So what you are able to note from that statistics is that for secondary average rate, it has been growing faster as compared to primary. So it is telling us something. So demand for secondary school has been growing faster as compared to demand for primary school. So we'll able to note what that translates into. Next. Chart 4 tells us the primary secondary enrollment. So this now shows the distribution per gender, both for primary and secondary. So let us go to the bar. If you look at the bar, we have different bars. For the green bar, it represents the primary boys. For the purple bar, primary girls. We have the yellow bar, secondary boys, and the blue bar is the secondary girls enrollment. So this is both private and public. So one thing we are able to notice that primary enrollment is higher as compared to secondary, as we have seen in that bar, that first chart. Then another thing we're able to notice that when you look at primary enrollment, there are more boys enrolling for primary as compared to girls enrolling for primary. Then something happened. There's a shift when it comes to secondary. So when you look at secondary enrollment, we are able to note that more girls are being enrolled at secondary level. So this shows us there's a transition problem with boys. So more girls, transition rates for girls is higher than that of boys in secondary schools. So this can be associated to some factors like the high opportunity cost schooling for boys, because more boys are likely to be pulled into casual labor, herding, transport, and even informal work. So that can explain why there's more transition for girls as compared to boys at secondary level. Then another thing we're able to note from this chart is that demand for secondary school has been growing over time. And between 2020 and 2024, the demand increased by 2.3%, the demand for enrollment for secondary schools. So it has been growing over time. Yes, next. Now, this chart shows us the public secondary school. So we have moved from cumulative enrollment, that is for both private and public. Now we are looking at public secondary school. So for public secondary school enrollment, the latest data available was between 2017 to 2020. So we are, again in this chart, we are able to see that the enrollment in secondary schools, public schools, has been increasing over time. So it still shows us that there's demand for public secondary schools. So it has been increasing over time. And on average, it has increased by 1.4%. So this graph still shows the demand for public secondary school has been increasing. Next. Now, this table 1, will help us understand the share of public versus private. So we want to show that public secondary school has the highest demand as compared to private. And if you look at our table, the first column shows us the different years. Second column, the public school, then their percentage share. Then we have the private school and the percentage share. So when we look at the year 2017, the enrollment at public schools was 2.5 million students. So that represented, out of the total available, that represented 93% share. Then we only had 200,000 students, or 0.2 million, enrolling for private secondary school. So, and that trend has been shown over the years. So close to more than 90% of students prefer enrolling in public secondary schools and not private secondary schools. So this can be due to income factors. We know private secondary schools are quite expensive as compared to public secondary schools. Then when we look at the last row that is highlighted in red, so this is just now the projection. So if the trend continues without any, if all factors are held constant and the trend continues, so we are able to know that by 2024, because the latest data did not provide the number of public schools public school enrollment by 2024, but the total enrollment was 4.3. So assuming the rate continues as it is, so this will imply that by 2024 we had 4.1 students enrolled at public schools. So that represented 95% of the total enrollment. So leaving us with only 5% enrolling for private schools. So we have seen the reason for this is the price effect and also the income effect. So many people opt for public schools because they are constrained by incomes and because public schools are cheaper as compared to private schools. So this table basically summarizes that the demand for public secondary school is high as compared to private secondary schools. Next. Now, Table 2 will show us the average school size in public secondary schools. So we have seen the demand for public secondary school is high as compared to demand for private secondary schools. So let us see the average school size in public secondary schools. So column 1 is the indicator. Then we have the year. So I want us to look at them per row. So the second row shows the enrollment. So the enrollment here represents the demand side of the equation or the education sector. So on the demand side, we are seeing the enrollment. It has been increasing over time. Then the number of institutions represent the supply side. So how as the government providing public institution to meet the demand that has been increasing over time. So we are able to note. Then the average school size is also growing. So it grew from 342 all the way to 374, and that is a 9.3% change. So public schools are becoming larger and larger. Now this last column that has been highlighted, so it explained to us something. So we're able to see, we say the enrollment is the demand, and we're seeing the percentage change over the period of between 2017 and 2020. Demand changed by 32%. Then for number of institutions, that is the supply side, it has changed by 20%. What does this tell us? Demand has been growing at a higher rate as compared to supply. So this shows there's a shortage somewhere in the supply of the number of institutions. So demand has been growing faster as compared to supply. Let us see what the next one. Now let us now see the disparity. We have seen that demand has been growing more than the supply. So what does that imply when we look at it at the county levels? So chart 6 tells us the average school size at public secondary school level. So what is the school size at public secondary level? So we are able to see that because now the demand has been growing more than the supply, there's congestion, and we are seeing Nairobi is affected because it has the highest average school size of 769. Remember, the national is at 374. So Nairobi has the highest. It is congested because of high population. We know Nairobi has high population, and also Turkana is also affected. This can be attributed to the fact that there are least number of schools in Turkana. If we saw the chart we had showed earlier that shows the number of schools, Turkana has the least number of schools. So it is congested as well. So the average school size for Nairobi is high, followed by Turkana, and you are able to know that major cities are having a higher number, a higher average school size. Then let us see what happens to school to teacher. Now, student to teacher ratio, Turkana is also affected. So we are student to teacher ratio just shows us how many students one teacher attends to. So we find that on average, one teacher attends to 29 students, but for Turkana, one teacher attends to many students. So teachers are overloaded with work. There's few teachers in Turkana as compared to Nairobi City is at 29. Isiolo has one teacher attending to 19. So this can be associated with factors like Isiolo is sparsely populated and there are fewer students attending schools. But we are seeing there is congestion or there's scarcity of teachers in Turkana, counties like Wajir, Mandera, Kilifi, Siaya. So one teacher attending to more students. Next. Chart 8 tells us the learners to classroom ratio. Again, in public schools, Turkana is again affected. Many learners share one classroom. So this is an infrastructure problem. So we are seeing that on average, So this shows that the average number of students sharing a classroom. Nairobi is also affected. It is number 2 with 47 students sharing one class. On average, it is 40. The average is the orange or the red bar. It shows that on average, 40 students share a classroom. So the next table will help us understand more on these charts that we have just seen. Next. Now, let us compare that average distribution with the standard deviation to show us the disparity. So the first column tells us just the indicator. We have the mean, then standard deviation, then the global. We want to compare it to the global average. So when you look at this table, we are able to note that on average, the average school size, the mean is 377. So every school is supposed to have at least 377 students. But the standard deviation shows a variation of 399. So most schools have of about 37. In addition to 377, they have 99 more students, and other schools have 99 less students. So it is unevenly distributed per county. Then when it comes to student to teacher, most schools, every school is supposed to have at least the mean of 30 teachers. But for the standard deviation, it shows us that most schools have an excess of 6 students being attended to by one teacher, and less other schools has less, which is 24 students attended by one teacher. So when you compare that to average, we are still on the higher side. The average side, the global average, as when you look at the OECD data, it shows that on average, a secondary school teacher should tend to at least 13 students. Then when it comes to classroom, learners to classroom, we are able to note that 39, that is the mean, but for the standard deviation, at least you find some school has got 34 learners in one classroom, others has 44. So when we compare ourselves to the global average, we still have that our classes have more students as compared to what the average mean suggests. Next. Now on the budget side, so we have seen that we saw that demand is growing fast as compared to supply. So let us see how the government is responding, because the only way we can know whether it is responding, because it's by what is their allocations when it comes to the budget. So chart 9 shows us the general or the recurrent development expenditure for all the Ministry of Education. So one thing we are able to know that is clear here is that the blue bar represent the recurrent expenditure, then the orange bar is represent the development expenditure. So we're able to know that over the period of time, so this is the amount in billions, expenditure has been growing, and it grew exceedingly in a bit higher in 2023, 2024, especially the recurrent, sorry. So we are able to note that the development expenditure has been lower as compared to the recurrent expenditure. So more of the Ministry of Education expenditure go to recurrent. Recurrent is the expenditure that goes to paying of teachers and other administration costs, while development is for expansion of school and infrastructure. So we are seeing that over time, it has been lower as compared to recurrent. Next. So we narrow it down to secondary school expenditure. That same trend is evident. So more of the expenditure goes to recurrent as compared to development. So in 2022, 2023, we are seeing there was high development expenditure. So these showed the period where junior secondary school classes were being built. That was why there was this shock. More funds were allocated towards development, but it was still less. So when you look at 2024, 2025, these are nominal values. So there's only 4 billion spent. It is equivalent to the same amount. It is equivalent to what was spent in 2020, 2021. So if you look at this value in real term, when inflation has been taken into consideration, it is lower. So development expenditure has been growing lower and lower. Next. Now, on a per student basis, we are able to know that for every student, the government allocates or spends 44,000 for recurrent and only 1,114 for development. So this is in thousands. So this still shows the small amount, and it has been growing from after 2023. It has been declining. So development expenditure has been declining over time, and the next table will help us understand. So this table shows the expenditure per student percentage. So when you look at the percentage expenditure, we are able to note that for every 100 shillings that was spent on education, 97% went to recurrent and only 2.5% went to development. So almost the entire cash goes to recurrent. So this can be attributed to fact that adjustment of wages, but it still shows that there's more need for the development expenditure. It is still far below. And you can look at that. And if you compare 2020, 2021 and 2024, 2025, it has almost been sliced by half. So from 2.5 to 1.2. So it has been decreasing over time, the development expenditure. Next. So this further illustrates where the development funds go to. So look at the columns that has been marked by the star. It shows us that in 2024, 2025, the approved estimate, this is the development expenditure, almost 3/4 of it went to primary basic equity. And that is the same case for net expenditure in 2025, 2026. It also went to primary. So of the 18 billion development expenditure allocated for the basic education, nearly 3/4 of it goes to primary. So only 4 billion is available for the secondary school expenditure. So this shows the priority. Next. So this is just a continuation now to show us the total. So we are seeing the total approved development expenditure is 18 for 2024, 2025. Then it is again 18, but it is projected to go down to 15. So we are seeing that there's still further cuts in development expenditure despite the need for infrastructure in secondary schools. Next. Now, what does that show? So we have seen there's a demand problem, there's a supply problem. So demand is growing faster than supply, and there's a shortage in classes. And this can be illustrated by the diagrams we are seeing. So this is just an illustration of how it is a problem that did not begin this year. It began earlier in 2021. These are parents waiting outside, and public schools are struggling with infrastructure crisis caused by high enrollment. And we are able to note the second picture on the right also shows that there's confusion. This is now last year. There's congestion in schools in the day one of grade 9. So we are seeing there's congestion in our public schools. The next. So these are just for the illustration. So this was for January 21st, 2026. So it also showed that public school distress, there's congestion, which is a growing concern, and people are worried about the safety of their children in school. And this is also from Pata Bari News, congestion in different schools. Imagine a school having 14 streams and students are not able to get proper care, and also they are too much congested. Next. Then, despite all that, the nation yesterday still president said that directs every chief to ensure that all grade 10 students report to school tomorrow with or without fees. So the state is still pushing for students to enroll, but there's still a problem. So I'll invite Kwame to take us through now the conclusion and recommendations. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So Vivian has taken us through establishing from the facts basically what's happening in secondary schools. Started with the fact that the value of education to any society and to a country such as Kenya is cannot be gainsaid. She also reminded us that first, there's a constitutional right to education and the quality education to every child, at least basic education, defined as education including primary schools, from early childhood education all the way to high school. So that's the first. The second thing is she's also showed us that on the basis of in addition to that right, it has significant economic and social value, which is the second one. And then the third is just basically this overriding uses and externalities that come from the fact that when an educated person does not just absorb all the benefits of that education, but confers that benefits in direct and indirect ways to the society in which she or he lives. So that's one. And then we went on the other side, and one of the things that we've shown is that based on that right and existing education policy, there is an overriding need to expand spaces, partly because of population growth in Kenya, meaning then that the obligation for government to provide public education is partly determined on the demand side by the number of students who are there. So it requires that planning and it requires the placement of that. And then so we compared the supply side, which is government availability of, provision of services, which is basically the teaching service, the administration side, supplying teachers and the HRPs for supplying education and existing physical facilities. Then she took us into the budget to look at how government responds. And the budget is the biggest policy statement government can make about any policy issue. Because in our view at the Institute of Economic Affairs, where government spends its money is what tells you what government policy is, regardless of what is written as a formal policy process. Because the budget means that you're giving life to whatever the policy intent is. And that outcome is what we assume was intended. So we looked at it and we've seen that the split between primary, rather, the split between the number of schools has been growing. So in terms of the number of high schools here, at 6.4%, basically per year over the last 4 years. And yet the provision of schools has been growing, rather the demand by students has been growing at about 6% every year. And the provision of schools has hardly grown and it's flat. We also know that 95% of all high school children, who are close to 5 million now, go to a public school. So the provision of public schools, the provision of education in Kenya, the constitutional right that we've spoken about is largely driven by state provision in primary in secondary schools. So those facilities matter. And then as we come towards the end, we see the mixing, or rather the meetup of the numbers in terms of the demand, the number of children who are able to go to school, and the availability of the resources for them. And we can see that the capacity for schools has been growing. In other words, not necessarily the number of students in every school, the average grew from about 300 to 374 on an average. And the spatial distribution of that's the national average, shows you that there's a very big standard deviation. And Vivian needed to have interpreted the standard deviation correctly. The standard deviation is not about, the standard deviation tells you how different your average school is from how different the existing number of schools are from the average. So while we know that the average school is about 374 students per person, per school, it varies a lot, as we saw in Turkana. It's close to 2 times what the national average is, and other schools in Malindi and smaller counties have that. So obviously we know that the population sizes of counties also determine the number of schools. So that spatial distribution partly represents the population in those places. But we know as well that places and urban areas in particular have some large schools. And for that reason, you have students or schools concentrated in certain parts and certain areas. And we saw that Nairobi, in spite of the fact that it bears 10% of Kenya's population, does not have a corresponding amount of schools in high schools, especially. It's about 100 secondary schools, suggesting that Nairobi and the areas around it, perhaps some of those children, some of the demand is met through attending school in other places. So the secondary schools market is actually a national market. It has a spatial distribution and concentration in specific areas, and it's also showing us the relative deprivation. And we can tell some parts of the country have very big schools and very small teaching force, which means that the schools are probably congested and the number of teachers is also quite low. We also know that while the numbers flatter Kenya in terms of the teacher-pupil ratios flatter Kenya, again, those are average numbers with a huge variation. And Vivian mentioned as well that sometimes, well, compared to OECD, and OECD countries have much higher incomes than Kenya, so obviously they just suggested Kenya is in all those areas at close to 1/3 or 1/2 of what it takes. But on the whole, the economics of secondary school means secondary schools have to be bigger than primary schools. And because we have fixed costs in the establishment of a school, the construction of facilities requires that you build on the fixed cost to make the secondary schools bigger. So just because the capacity is larger by itself, we argue is not enough. But as you've seen the collision of the demand with the growing population and the demand side, you can tell that schools are really, really congested. Now, some of the complaints you see are actually directed at secondary school, the principals of high schools, but it's not their fault. Vivian has shown us through the budget that government has actually underinvested in secondary school infrastructure development, so that you can tell that the recurrent expenditure is 4 billion per year, which is less than half of what the tax collection for every year is. I mean, for every day is. The tax collection in Kenya for every day is closer to 7 billion, closer to 8-9 billion shillings. And for the whole year, for 5 million students, government is spending on the construction side and the development side 4 billion. That, you notice, is less than 10% of what is spent on the housing development fund. So we can ask ourselves where government's prioritization comes from, and that's where our recommendations here come. So the first is it's very, very clear that there is a need to not just prioritize, but actually to ramp up expenditure, infrastructure development in public secondary schools in Kenya. Driven not just by the fact that we are starting from a low base, 4 billion is hardly enough to construct enough schools given the demand, but also the population of this country for people who are dedicated, are promised by the constitution their rights to education. So government had better step up this very, very quickly. Or the crisis that we saw and the presidential directive for people to go to schools will not be enough. I think the crisis will only get worse. So this is a point we cannot overemphasize. The second one is, so related to the prioritization, basically, is the fact that, look, when you hear certain political leaders saying that, look, you are asking other students from other places to come and displace our part and displace the students from this place, many people take umbrage or take offense at that. But that notwithstanding, if you look at the data that Vivian has sent to us, it's telling us why some of that unpalatable talk was part of the national conversation. And we should open up to what it's telling us about the state of schools, as opposed to what it's telling us about the refinement of the political leader who said it. What it's showing is that schools are showing stress. And when it's showing stress, people are starting to see or think of schooling as a zero-sum game. So that if one child gets is enrolled in one school, it means another child has lost that chance. So the expansion of secondary schools, and especially secondary schools, and the fact that there's congestion is partly what is driving the flavor of political talk that we've seen. It is not for us to defend it, but to see underlying it, the fact that this congestion in schools is actually showing the seams and that pressure. And perhaps in a way, providing justification for whoever speaks like that, for people in their neighborhood to actually see that they're making sense. So it's clear, part of the way to resolve this is not to tell people to stop saying what some people consider nonsense, but actually for government to expand schools so that Kenyan children, given their constitutional rights, don't have to compete with each other and have divisive talk, mediating how national policy is determined. So that's the first point. The second is the public disclosure on public education data is woefully inadequate in our finding. As you can see, we'd have liked to drill much, much more to not only sub-county level, but also to actually understand the distribution of teachers by school in this country. That data should be administrative data available in the public sector, but it is not published. I think that publication is necessary because it will complete the conversations such as the ones that people are having right now. The third point is that it is evident the government of Kenya should prioritize investment in non-residential schools. Why? You saw that classroom sizes are actually growing. And again, the classroom sizes are average. Given the redefinition and the CBC system, obviously, the demand in secondary schools is just going to increase. It's not going to stop. And for the next generation, I see the number of children going into schools every year being bigger than the succeeding generation, than the previous generation, meaning that this demand surge is very strong and it's going to continue for as long as it's possible. So what that places in our hands is the fact, that the expansion of non-residential schools is going to be the superior one, because as you can see in the snapshot that Vivian showed about a secondary school in Nairobi, and it's not to pick on one specific person, actually, this is a problem throughout secondary schools. There's pressure from the Ministry of Education for schools to expand enrollment under the pretext of chasing the constitutional rights, but the free secondary education right, and at the same time, obviously, full enrollment between transition from primary to secondary schools. And those who are bearing the burden are school administrators, such as principals, who have to take in students based conditioned by the demand from the Ministry of Education, and then have to face the parents because the quality of accommodation for students, school dining facilities, even fields have now been constructed into classes. So we have schools that do not have playgrounds and stuff like that. And while we understand parental indignance and irritation about this, I actually think that whoever is sending these messages ought to send them to the Ministry of Education and to the Parliamentary Committee on Education and Budgets. This is what they're doing. By restricting funding or insufficiently funding public school expansion, what they're doing is, down the line, reproducing conflict between teachers and students. Between teachers and parents who think that school enrollment is leading to deterioration of standards. But what that means is that for the cost effectiveness purposes, government actually should re-emphasize and confront the idea in Kenya that every secondary school every secondary school student ought to be in a residential school, because residential schools have additional requirements on the public pass, which, as we can see, is struggling. So government should prioritize public school education, yes, especially day school non-residential education, and ask parents who want the premium service of students sitting in good dorms with air-conditioned staff to actually pay for that. But the priority for today, in my view, is to provide students with classes, with laboratories, and obviously with teachers and teaching services. It's not to provide the hotel services that looks like this is the fight right now. So what are our conclusions? I think it's clear that demand for public education is growing and will continue to grow in our assessment for the next generation. So it's going to be the biggest service that the public sector provides by huge numbers. It's big. Remember, Kenyans have 14 million students wake up every day and go either to a primary school or a secondary school. If you include those in ECD, we are getting close to 20 million or 18 million based on the numbers that exist today. That is a bigger service than any other that the government provides. So the importance of education as illustrating government's competence in public service delivery cannot be overstated. And so the demand is going to grow. We have no excuses. So perhaps prioritization should actually change. So this thing about building good houses for the purposes of illustration, and yet students in schools are sleeping perhaps on the floor or in tents, or do they even sleep based on some of the stuff that we've had, or have sleep in the same classes that they actually learn in the day, is obviously a signal, an undeniable signal that we have the prioritization role. There's inadequate infrastructure expenditure. All of it cannot be funded by parents, to be honest, based on our tax rates, but also based on the promise, the requirement for government to ramp up infrastructure expenditure in secondary schools is clear. We know that most development expenditure still goes to primary education, and at the same time, it jumped in when the JSS requirements came in, and then immediately after that, went back down to very low levels. If you compare it both in nominal terms and also if you load it on inflation, the public sector investment in secondary school development on the development side is actually shrinking, all while demand is growing. The public schools are congested, so it's clear. And what we don't know is, because of the hidden numbers, where we don't have numbers by school, the overall numbers show us, and the consequence of those numbers are the conflict that we're showing, where parents are complaining in social media and sometimes in the news about how head teachers are leading to schools, or rather are recruiting too many students in schools and leading to the deterioration of the standards in class sizes, basically laboratories provision, and obviously other facilities that are necessary for schools to function. And it looks like we are blaming the wrong side. This conversation should be had centrally with the Ministry of Education itself, and especially parliamentary committees. Why? Because they determine education policy, but also they fund education. So if they're underfunding it, I think they should be able to justify why they have done that and not have parents confront teachers as if teachers are, and head teachers specifically, are keeping that money to themselves. And we think Parliament incorrectly supports fragmentation of education budgets. You've seen one of the things that has been boasted about by members of Parliament. And I admire members of Parliament who support secondary education or education at all levels. But, and this is clear, I have to state this, I don't think members of Parliament should be boasting about how much they use CDF to support secondary school education and that. Because it is very, very clear that the fragmentation of education budgets is part of what is leading to this problem. They ought to, because they passed the budget, we have a budget making Parliament under Article 201 and Article all the way to Article 209 of the Constitution, telling us that Parliament is responsible for passing budget as legislation. So there's no reason to dedicate to yourself a CDF amount and then go out there issuing checks and taking photos of it. I mean, you're doing nothing. The most important thing is to consolidate the education budget and ensure every child who has a constitutional right gets an opportunity to learn. So yes, you can support and talk about how much you've given a discount to parents. You haven't done much. Your primary function as a member of Parliament is not to distribute CDF bursary checks, but actually to pass legislation and budgets that fund that education for everybody. That's something to be proud of. Otherwise, what we have is fragmenting budgets and using it for personal aggrandizement while leaving children all over the country and throughout the Republic with ill-equipped facilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much to my colleagues, Vivian and Kwame, for the presentation that they have made to us. And of that presentation, Vivian started by taking us through the data. And of course, data does not lie. And the data has clearly pointed to a growing demand for public education. And she further went to give us find that there's growing demand for public education. And what are the consequences of that? And the consequences, as she has clearly pointed, is that the demand side is not being, the growing demand side is not being matched by the supply side. And so the result of that is having public schools that are very congested. And this is largely in relation to the infrastructure and the distribution of these schools. And then while they've also talked to us about the budgetary allocations by the Ministry of Education. And the big question why that was important is for us to be able to see whether or not the ministry is actually prioritizing the right things. The priorities that they are giving, are they putting into consideration the fact that there's a growing demand, especially for public education, mainly the secondary school side. So the supply side is obviously there's clearly a need for them to pull up their socks, and pulling up their socks is largely around reprioritizing, especially if they are to meet effectively the growing demand that we have clearly seen. So without further ado, we would like now to proceed to the Q&A session where you have an opportunity to ask your questions. I can see we already have a few questions on the chat box, but before we go to that, if we have anybody who would like to use the raising hand option on your toolbar, on your Teams, and unmute yourself and ask your question. So Christine, please unmute yourself. And as Christine is unmuting herself, Fiona, you had asked a question which I think Kwame has responded to, but you also asked What factors could explain why some counties have more schools than others? Kwame may have alluded to this, but we'll give them an opportunity to respond as they will be responding to the question Christine will be raising. And then Joanne is also saying she appreciates the important conversation we are having today, and she further asks, what may be the rationale behind expanding more on primary education, noting the transition mess. And I think this for her is comes off what we have seen, the crisis we have seen with the transition from grade 9 to 10. And then consolidation of the education budget is a great proposal in the right direction, probably in response to the recommendations that we have. So Christine, please ask your question so that my colleagues can respond to all the questions during this first round of Q&A. Christine?
Thank you so much, Winnie, and thank you so much, our presenters, for the highlights you shared with us. Me, I have a concern because I'm speaking in terms of Kakamega County. What I've seen is happening in our schools, especially the public primary schools, whereby one of the requirements when a student is required is to buy chairs and desks. And then now in secondary schools like Kakamega and Musing, what I've noticed with these schools, they have infrastructure. This infrastructure is being collected in a voted, whereby if a new parent brings a new student, you have to deposit money for construction. Now what they do with this money, they build extra classes, whereby now what they do, they normally recruit students. These students, they are like players, so that they can enable them, their name to be heard in rugby and things like that. And then now those students, it's like they don't pay any fees until they finish school. Their work is like they are just players. But now these extra classrooms, the money, parents pay money, and then it's like now it doesn't reflect in their receipts. It's something different from the others. And then we have how can we align NGCDF? We also have World Bank, Ministry of Education, and parents constructing schools in classrooms in schools. How can we align these programs? Because I'm seeing, for instance, I can give an example. You'll find the Ministry of Education has constructed a classroom, and they normally indicate this one was constructed by the Ministry of Education. But in other schools, you'll find they won't indicate whether it's an NGCDF project or the World Bank project. How can we align these projects? Over to you. Thank you.
All right, so thank you for the question, Christine. So I'll have my colleagues respond, and we'll start with Kwame. Kwame?
All right. So first, I'll just go to Fiona's question, which was basically what explains the differences in the number of schools by county. Okay, it's probably not one explanation, but I think the most important one is that population varies, right? It's not everything, but population varies. So if you have a county that has many more students, you're probably going to have more schools in that county based on education planning. You think that yes, if people go here, that might explain. So that might be one of the drivers, but it's not the only one, because then it wouldn't explain Nairobi's numbers, for instance. But I think that population does. So for the lowest ones, such as Tana River, Isiolo, and Lamu, it's partly explained by the population, the sparse population in some of those areas, especially since Lamu has the smallest population in Kenya. You see that it has the smallest number of secondary schools as well. That might reflect the local demand for that. So that might be one. The other might also be, some of this is antecedents and our history in Kenya. Certain parts of the country, because formal education in Kenya was driven by settlement patterns of the colonial populations, also tend to have many more schools. So those areas have kept that advantage, and because of that, those schools have been maintained, and so they exist in certain areas more than others. I think the third factor might also be just the local preferences. I think if local preferences supported the construction of local schools, that might be when those schools were actually supported by government. I mean, subsequently absorbed by government, taken over by government. So it's a mix of of other factors. Okay, of course, one other would be urbanization. You can tell that most schools close to the major urban areas, most areas close to the major urban areas have the biggest schools that are among those schools. So it's a complex mix of many factors. But you're right. I mean, the question you're asking is, I think the question I would ask related to you is, education demand should be the determinant of where the schools exist, not Kenya's history and not Kenya's especially historical patterns of school construction. I think it should follow where the education demand is, and what that would be partly a function of populations. But we also know that a Kenyan has the right to receive that education regardless of where they are. So you could be born in Tana River, and if you want to come to Nairobi to get education, it should still be possible. So some of that, those areas should be, should determine how education, the facilities should be distributed. So I guess that's one answer. Now, the second one from Joanne was basically about the rationale. Joanne, I think this is something that my colleague Vivian will add to, but the rationale for that expansion was that, you remember in 2023, because the JSS class, after the CBC, the competency-based budget was brought in, the JSS class was supposed to come in, I think, in 2023-24. And for that reason, there was a bump in that construction, as you can tell, for the previous 3 years in 2024 and all that. So part of that was basically the Ministry of Education expanding infrastructure in primary schools to receive the junior secondary school classes. So that explains that bump in those years. So again, it's students, because of the introduction of the junior secondary school category, school facilities needed to be expanded, and government gave a one-time injection. And that's what we bothered with, because constructing schools on the basis of a shock such as that, and only once, without maintaining or sustaining performance, is, in my view, a problem. And I think that it does exist, but I think an education and infrastructure development plan, that is for a longer term one, where is required and should be separated from the regular budget programs. It should be a program that actually takes precedence and goes on over time. It does exist through the various phases of education expansion and primary school expansion. The problem is that it's clear that the amounts are inadequate. So that's going to lead to the infrastructure. I mean, that's what's going to lead to what we see as highly congested schools in the city. I think we should make clear, it is clear that in all parts of the world, but more especially given Kenya's conditions, secondary schools should get bigger because you have fixed facilities. So there's a fixed component to the establishment of a secondary school. So expanding those schools should be an acceptable one, regardless of what schools they are. I mean, I don't accept this view that we should construct new schools because there are certain schools that are special and they should only take a certain number of students from specific places, perhaps from specific classes as well of the economic status and stuff like that. Public schools must be expanded because it's easier to use teachers more cost effectively when you have many of them here. And some public schools, even in places such as the United States, which has a high number of teachers, are as big as maybe 2,000 students. And it's possible for the planning and for categorizing, for the planning and for the facilities to be built to be able to take that number. Why? Because if you have already fixed costs in the construction of the school, or rather in the establishment of the school, then it is possible to build on what exists as opposed to constructing new ones. So yes, there should be a program of retooling existing schools by expanding their capacity, but also partly constructing other schools so that we are cutting that demand, meeting that demand from two sides. Now, about you see, if you say that secondary schools in Kenya, Christine, are arbitraging by asking existing parents to pay an extra fee, which is not approved by the Ministry of Education for construction, then what that means is that secondary schools are responding to the inadequate supply of expansion of their capacity by asking parents to build, to pay for that capacity expansion, and then abusing that authority by then introducing students who do not even go to school for the purposes of PR. Why? They recruit students who do not pay fees, who play one sport or the other, or engage in one activity that helps to build the name of that school, right, for PR purposes, or to build the structure of that school, to increase the demand, and then do that. Now, that reflects two things. One, inadequate expansion, which was underfunded expansion of schools, because the capacity of every school should be determined by the norms and standards established by the Ministry of Education. So even new construction within a school for the purposes of safety should be approved by the Ministry of Education, because that's why they exist, to regulate it. So if that is happening without the authority of the Ministry of Education, obviously, it shows you that the Ministry of Education is failing first to fund capacity that is consistent with the new demand, but also secondly, failing to properly regulate and oversee, have oversight of schools. Because if schools recruit students for the purposes of just ensuring that they play one sport or the other, or engage in one activity that is not related to education, then they're cheating and violating perhaps the norms. And if the Ministry of Education is not aware of that, then they're failing. So that's one of the reasons why we think all these reflect policy and regulatory failure much, much more than what happens in those schools. So I don't know how that can be regulated. I don't know why how that can be regulated. So for instance, I also think it's a reflection of a lie to say that, look, we have sent capitation to schools, which is fine, but the student who's coming to school is asked to supply their own seat and desk. That means that government is underfunding schools, and we understand completely. There's a problem and there's a scarcity of cash. But our view is the prioritization of education as the biggest service the public sector provides cannot just be in recruiting teachers every year. Long-term investment in the capacity of schools to meet the education demand requires expansion of school facilities, furniture, hand in hand with the physical infrastructure. So asking teachers, students to actually come with their own desk and seat means you're violating the policy of free secondary education or free primary education, and giving a window to headmasters, or we call it principals rather, to use those pockets for whatever other reasons that obviously violate the rights of students and obviously, quote unquote, oppress the targets of these pupils. Yeah.
Thanks, Kwame. Vivian, you have a chance to weigh in on the questions.
Okay, thank you. I'll just add something briefly. For Fiona's question, they have been answered. Yeah, it is the best approach is to expand schools, rather than building more schools. Then now to add more to Joanne's question on why the rationale behind spending more on primary education. Maybe you can take us to slide 20. It shows us something. Yeah, this slide, it shows us that for the primary school, the first thing we notice is that primary school has a higher number of students as compared to secondary. So that can be attributing to this fact, because there are more, the demand is more, there are many students. Then another thing is that when we are looking at the priority, we are seeing what takes most of that development expenditure is not even infrastructure itself, it is Kenya Primary Education Equity and Learning Program. So this shows the priority. So the reason for that more expenditure on primary education is it is a priority of the government. It is not even on the infrastructure, but on the public education equity. So that is what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivian. Anybody else with a question they would like to voice? You have a chance to raise your hand and you will have the opportunity. Anyone? And I think in response to Christine's question as well, Joanne says parents paying for capacity expansion is the norm, and this is what leads to increase in fees. This is, I think, in response to what Christine was speaking about. Anyone else with a question? Okay, there being no question, I would now give the opportunity for our presenters to give their closing remarks. So we will start with Vivian. Vivian, your closing remarks?
Okay, thank you. So I'd love to thank everyone for joining us and for being part of this. So indeed, Kenya has truly succeeded in getting children into school. Now, there's still challenge, and we are able to notice that more money or more allocation more money is being spent each year to keep students in school, while less is being invested in expanding or improving infrastructure. And that has costed even parents. So there's a challenge that should be addressed, and we have seen that demand for education will continue to grow because there is more population that is entering into the education sector. So thank you very much for joining, and we are glad you are here.
Thank you, Vivian. Kwame?
All right. Okay, so two things that we've established. One of those is that the demand for education, secondary school level, is going to be higher. It's just going, it's high, and it's going to stay high. Meaning that because of the constitutional requirements and the public service facts that this is the biggest public service that government provides, it will call for a prioritization of this sector, both in terms of the supply side, because the demand side is almost guaranteed, right? So that's one. What it tells you is that when you look at the education budget in Kenya, even as it exists, it is possible to use it more cost effectively to ensure that you're providing an education service consistent with the requirements of the constitution and all that. And what we've had is this fragmentation of the budgets, and I think more like short-term thinking. So it will not suffice to have presidential directives telling chiefs, for instance. The very fact that you have a presidential directive where a chief is told to ensure that all children, using administrative facilities of government to ensure that children go to schools when the capacity constraints are evident, is in itself jumping from the pan into the from the frying pan into the fire. I think it's evident that Kenya's infrastructure for schools is not just woefully inadequate, but just actually well below what the demand should be. So the collision of those facts is what is leading to congestion in schools. You've had schools where the quality of food was not just bad, but children suffered poisoning, food poisoning, and stuff like that. So all these things that we are seeing as national guidelines, national headlines, in addition to the political rhetoric from one or the other leader, are themselves suggestions that they're symptoms of the fact that there's been underinvestment in a public service, which has constitutional safeguards and demand, and which also is the government's biggest blueprint. So in my footprint. So in my view, the quality of education and all the fact that this is a moving vehicle with spare parts falling apart and where you can see through the chassis and into the car is a reflection of government's competence. And it's a failure by both the national government, and it's a failure by both the National Assembly, the representative part of politics, and also the execution part of national policies. So infrastructure development and reprioritization, actually reworking existing budgets, is necessary. And it's something that Parliament should take a little bit more seriously. And of course, the disclosure of public education data is essential. But we can see that I think unless a serious revamp and rethinking, and in our view, we should take up all that money that we are saving because we can't construct enough houses and put them in schools now. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Kwame and Vivian, for taking us through this morning's conversation. I think for the participants, it would be a good moment to give them a round of applause using the clap icon on your provision. Sorry. Okay, there's a question from Goga. I think we could take a last one. Goga, do you want to voice it, or were you intending to give a clap?
Sorry, I was intending to give a clap, but thank you so much for the presentation.
All right, thank you, Goga. So we appreciate that, as usual, you always make time to join us for these conversations. We do not take it for granted. And we want to remind us all that the Institute of Economic Affairs is a membership organization. And so if you wish to join us as a member, please reach out to our communications team, Michelle and Oscar, and they will be very glad to take you through the process of joining. And also to notify you that you continue being on the lookout on our social media pages for more insightful conversations. And next week, we have 3 very insightful conversations lined up for you. So if you'll be interested in any of these 3, please make a calendar reminder. So on Monday, we'll be having a conversation from Leo and Kwame on the standards levy as quasi tax and their effects on industrial growth in Kenya. And then on Wednesday, we'll be having one on trade, the lessons on trade policies from Kenya's COMESA, sugar safeguard by Emmanuel and Moses. And then on Thursday, my colleagues Leo and Jackie will be speaking on assessing the implementation of Kenya's EGP systems, policy, and reform priorities. So if any of those are areas that you'd be interested in, please set a reminder and also be on the lookout on our social media pages and plug in and join the conversation. That said, once again, asanteni sana for joining, and do have a beautiful, lovely afternoon. Thank you.